Salt hung in the air like a hand that would not let his throat go. The ship was small, brazen with a hull that had been patched in more places than a soldier's cloak. But it knew the summer currents by touch and slid them as a trout slides the cold bones of a river. Eddard Stark stood at the prow because he had learned, in a different life, that a lord should not hide from wind or spray if he meant to command men who had to swallow both. He was no lord here. The sailor with a golden front tooth who steered by the feel of tide named him Heron for the sake of convenience, and the rest of the crew called him Old Knife when they thought he could not hear. The name fit. He had been a blade once. He suspected he had become, like many blades in later years, good only for cutting bread and memory. Beyond the prow the sea opened flat and shining and as wide as rumor. The city that waited across it was a heat-born name, Meereen. It rose, everyone told him, like a brick-red claw from desert flatlands, clawing the sky with pyramids that preened and brooded in the same breath. To reach it, he had allowed himself to be ferried along a chain of favors and forgotten loyalties stretching from a seller in Bravos to a merchant in Pentos who never said the word Varys aloud and never said the word Stark at all. He did not think often of the man who engineered escapes like a cook trussing quails and sending them off to roast. He thought instead of the things he had left undone. A bastard son raised as a son. Daughters who had been led away like birds startled and beating at night air. A wife who had once kept the accounting of the winter stores in a hand as careful as a harpist, and who had scolded and loved in equal measures. A younger sister carried in his arms out of a room that had smelled of blood and flowers, and a promise that had been a chain on his thought for half a life. When the wind came harder, it sharpened his eyes. The captain had shown him a chart with plucked gulls and exaggeration, lines scratched with a nail and everything important in a hand too small. Eddard had wanted to laugh at the presumption a little, how anyone thought to draw the sea as if it could be managed, but laughter stuck. The ship broke the spine of the first wave of that morning in a clean thrust. A boy darted past with a coil of rope nearly as large as himself, the kind of boy George the Master of Horse would have cuffed once, and then praised twice when he turned 17 and rode a gelding up and down the yard without twitching at a dog's bark. Names crowded anything like peace. He breathed. He watched. He had not expected to see dragons again in the world. Men claimed to have seen 1,000 things. Merchants in claret-colored shoes said they had drunk wine in Carth that changed the color of their eyes for a day and a night. Sailors claimed the sea sang. But there had been talk that stood straight when he probed. A young queen who had stalked the Dothraki sea like a storm and then grown dragons out of the ashes of a funeral pyre. He had heard the story so many times across so many tavern tables that it had lost the shimmer of a tale and settled into that plainer truth that a rumor achieves when it endures, like a stone in the hand that starts as a shine and becomes a weight. He had come to see her with an intention that did not fit simple lines. He had come because there were matters of blood that no man can keep alone forever, and because Westeros, which had been the only home he could allow himself to name, had never stopped bleeding in his mind. Meereen was a smoke-red beast from the water. The bay was a warm bruise of a color he lacked words for, something between green and the memory of green, and the city's pyramids rose in layered arrogance. 3 black mouths gaped where the harbors opened their tongues, and within lay a scatter of ships with sails like jars of paint knocked over in a handling too rough. Colors poured everywhere. The docks bellowed and clanked. The smell of fish and dust competed with a sweetness he only identified when he saw it cooling on flat trays. Sugared dates. On a stone quay hung a row of men whose gold masks had slipped in death so that the mouths underneath grinned and gaped at the tide. A soldier with the face of a statue and a spear like a gatepost watched the ship unload. The man's eyes were bored holes in a mask of indifference. Eddard had never seen soldiers like them in the flesh, only in stories told with a chill in the voice. Men gelded, beaten, trained to be obedient as iron nails. Later he would learn the word they owned for themselves, unsullied, and he would find a careful respect settling alongside his sorrow. For now he saw an army that helped a queen hold a city where the walls were still deciding what they thought of her. The captain pressed a token of his cargo fees into a steward's ink-stained fingers and gave Eddard a look that was the shape of a goodbye no one wanted to make aloud. "Your name," the steward said in the common tongue with the careful crispness of one who wanted no more work than a syllable demanded. Heron, Eddard said, because the sea left certain masks sticky on the skin. You've business in the city? I have a petition. The steward's eyes traveled over him. In Meereen, a man wore heat. Eddard had learned not to sweat like a frightened colt, but his northern bones had not learned to love air that pressed on a man as a second tunic. He stood in his homespun and his leathered boots, gray touching the hair at his temples. The steward made a black line in his ledger and lifted 2 fingers. The Unsullied with the gatepost spear ducked his head, impassive, and led Eddard into a city that was loud with lives that had only recently stopped being weighed on scales. The streets wound as if drunk. Brick showed everywhere, glowering and bright, with painted tiles that told stories in a language of color. He saw a woman carry casserole's balance, D on her head with a grace he did not know. He saw a boy with a brand healed into a scar across his cheek, hawk vases built in the shape of serpents and moons. A mule pissed in a stream, a liter of heat into heat. The Unsullied led him through a market where the meat was open to flies and the fruit to the sun, and then under a gate shaped like a mouth that had swallowed too many men to bother chewing. He knew a palace when he felt the shade change. Shadow laid a hand on the back of his neck gently. The giant pyramid that was the queen's house chewed the sky and threw back cool. They stopped before a woman in a white dress of a cut new to his eyes, with hair braided as if a map had been drawn into it. She was small only for a moment. Then she turned and he saw the angles of a composure not native to this place. "What is your petition?" she asked in a voice so calm it made sweat embarrassed of itself. "An audience," he said, "with the queen." He had practiced the words in the low hours when the ship creaked like an old woman's knees. He had promised himself he would not let breath see through them. The queen hears petitions in the afternoons. It is dangerous to ask for exceptions, and tedious for us both when exceptions are refused. But your face states what your tongue won't. What do you carry that won't be safe to bend to the sun? Her mouth allowed itself a near smile, not unkind. "I am Missandei, and I translate for her grace in 3 tongues when she wants to be known, in 7 when she wants to be feared. My name is not meant for the sun or the market," he said, and the lie tasted wrong and right at once. "My matters would rest better in the shade." Missandei's eyes flicked to the Unsullied, who made the smallest tilt of his head. "The queen is never out of petitions, but you may be a petition. Come." He followed into a cooling that felt not like winter but like a hand generously wet and laid along the brow. Halls rose and did not end where he expected them to end. On a landing they passed a man old enough to be done with all the labor of life, but he still wore a sword at his side and carried himself like the scabbard was heavier than the blade out of habit. The man's hair was white and his step was the precise, wooden carefulness of one who had worn steel into his joints for too many years to put it away. His eyes touched Eddard and slid off as if just then one detail had snagged in a mind that disliked having anything slip. Astonishment passing behind a door and then shut. Eddard had known too many men like this to ignore the way this one's hand tightened on the hilt for the span of a breath. He reminded himself not to reach for a sword that wasn't his. "My lady," the white-haired man said, not looking at him. "Her grace is with the children." "The children," Missandei repeated. "It is an ill hour for politics." "She has made motherhood part of politics," the man murmured. "She does that with most things." They came into a hall as spare as a waiting room before judgment. The throne was not a throne, because here men had sat on step pyramids to talk about rice and blood for hundreds of years, and who needs a crown of metal when stairs can lift you to the height you require. The woman who stood before that first stair wore a dress of cloud-colored silk that had been cut to look like an easy thought and had taken someone a month to coerce. Her hair was pale as baked wheat pulled from an oven at the right moment. It spilled down the back in braids that changed in tension as they fell. 2 small dragons nosed at a platter of raw goat. A third lifted a wedge of meat and shook it as if it would wake and run. There are moments when a man's life takes a new rib. He felt it then, something new caging breath. She was younger than his Caitlin had been when they wed, younger than the years she carried like a mantle had made him expect. But there was a density to her presence as if all her hours agreed, at least about this. "We live here now, in this body." Eddard had thought often about kings. He had measured men against duty and found them wanting, had weighed counsel against appetite, and he had learned to distrust the ease with which men saw crowns as hats and not burdens. It was a new thing to be in a room with a queen whose legend had outrun her bones. He was faintly ashamed he had not prepared for her to be a person. "Missandei," she said without turning, in a voice that had both roughness and water in it. "You keep me longer than my patience." She turned, and her eyes were the blue of sky in the hour a storm argues with itself. She was not a tall woman. She did not need to be. "Who asks?" "A petitioner, your grace," Missandei said. "He has no name that we want to hear for now." Eddard did not kneel at once because answering a queen with his spine had almost killed him once. He took one step, then another, everything slow as frost forming under a door. "Your grace," he said, and when he lowered himself it was not to beg. He offered the gesture like the right shape for this meeting, a cup to set something in. He felt the floor against the knee that had been stiff since a winter hunt when a boar had slipped behind a stand of aspen and made him look the wrong way at the wrong moment. Everything that made him stiff answered. He stayed down. "Rise, man without a name," the queen said, and it was said the way all good orders are given, with the assumption they will be obeyed. When he stood, she studied the years that had tanned his skin and the knuckles larger than they had any right to be and the way he placed his weight. "Do you bring me news? Or trouble?" "Both," he said, because he was tired of learning the hard way what men tried to decorate with one word always showed itself with the other as well. The white-haired knight had taken 3 steps closer. Missandei had not moved at all, and yet he was certain she had moved something, in herself or in the room. The dragons, not much larger than hounds in their first proof of growth, watched him with the bland interest of predators who find everything potential. He remembered a shepherd in the north years ago who had kept wolves. Somehow, in a pen behind his house like a secret that had grown too large to be a secret. The animals had watched Eddard with eyes like coals at the edge of morning. He had hoped then that the children in that thatched house would learn when not to run. "You fear nothing," the queen said. "I have learned to fear what deserves it," he replied. "I have also learned that fear sharpens your sight and dulls your will. I have need of both." "You talk like a soldier who used to be a lord," the knight said, flat as a bench. Eddard looked at him, and in the space between his held breath and his next, he allowed a name to stand in the room. "Ser Barristan," he said. The old man's eyes narrowed and then opened again with all the courtesy a man can summon when asked whether he remembers the very road his youth walked. "I saw you once at a tourney that meant too much to too many men. You unhorsed a boy who praised you as he fell." "Men love the shape of their defeat," Ser Barristan said, dry. "They find it instructive. It is a relief to see someone old enough to be done with instruction." "Your name." He could keep it no longer. There were places in a life where the longer a man wore a mask, the more truth the mask began to speak through the mouth he thought was his own. He had not come here to conceal a thing that would curdle in him and then in the world. He looked at the queen as a man who had not saved her father looked at his father's daughter. "Eddard Stark," he said. Silence lived a full minute in the room and got comfortable. Missandei's chin moved the distance of a flinch and a thought. Ser Barristan's hand had already tightened on his hilt once today. Now it felt for it outright, not to draw but to remind a body what it was for. The dragons shifted their balanced bodies, and the air took on the faint, warm smell of the metal breath that comes just before lightning hits a tree. The queen took a breath that he watched in her throat like a swallow that had decided to stay. "That man is dead," she said. She said it without rancor. The fact and the bitterness of the fact were so old that they had lost their mutual heat and had become just a thing lived with. "He died for the treasons of my father's killers. He died for mine." "He died," Eddard said evenly, "and did not. Death is a matter of witnesses. The wrong witness might make a death fact. The right witness can unmake almost anything." He had not thought he would say it that way. He realized he had made this sound like a trick. He had meant it like an apology. "I am sorry," he added, and the word was plain bread. "What do you want?" she asked. "Why would you show me your face?" There are men still in this city who would hang gold on their children if it bought them the tale that Daenerys Stormborn broke her own oath and set at her table a man who used to set the table for a usurper. Her mouth did a small thing he could not name and would not call a smile again. But there are also men who will whisper that I took the man of honor who would not kill a girl baby in her cradle and made him sit at my side. I cannot be the salve you apply to both wounds, he said softly. You must choose which to show and when. I came because I am not done with my life's debt to your house, and because my debts to mine are strangling me. I know Westeros. I know the men who will kneel and lie, and the men who will stand and call it kneeling. I know the ice that comes whether any of us earn it, and the hunger that comes when you forget the cheese you stored under the eave. I know a son of a prince, and a house made of snow and gray wolves that would be faithful to a good queen and stubborn with a bad one. I know the games that make lords drunk and the true cost of victory when it is paid by shepherds. I know all these, and I will not let them rot in me. If you are, as the stories say, you will not want me to rot. And if I am not? She asked, and the admission of uncertainty was made brave to sound like challenge. If I am only a woman who is tired of blood until the day she is not, then I will say so to your face, he said. It will be what you pay me for. Ser Barristan half laughed, the sound like a hand clapped softly against a shield. He asks employment, your grace, and offers honesty as if it were an exotic grain. The rarest, Missandei murmured. Your father, the queen said, and the words came carefully, as if the shape of them might cut. You served a man who took a throne from a father who burned men alive. Where were you then, Eddard Stark? How long a leisure does it take a noble conscience to decide when fire is wrong? In a riverland's holdfast with a belly full of grief and the weight of my friend's will on my neck, he said, and his voice did not break. It would not. It had broken once, long ago, and he had learned the craft of strength as men learn to stitch, by crude tries and cursing and finally a fine seam. I served a man I had swung my sword beside and called brother when I had lived hard in the smell of his sweat and knew what shape his mercy took. I fled a king whose mercy had grown narrow and cruel and called it justice. I am not a scholar of kings, your grace. I am a man who hears pleas and splits a knot with a sword only when the rope is too thick for a knife. She came down one stair, then another, the silk whispering around her legs as if it had affection. Why me? Because you did not kill children to make a point, he said. Because when you took a city, you sat where the men who ruled it sat and discovered their view demanded a stomach. Because you stopped to hear a man speak for his father even when there was a pair of scales in your hand and the weight of cruelty on one side of them was so great you could have been excused for erring with your heart. Because I hear, he paused, because the next was an insult if spoken wrong and a gift if spoken right. Because I hear you have dragons, and even so you try words first. Words, she said, and her mouth's shape returned. Words burn slower, but they feed more, he said. She stood a moment with the stairs behind her, and distance, a luxury in a room like a darts board with too many thrown into it. Then she turned to Ser Barristan. If he is what he says, what does that demand of me? It demands that you decide whether you want a counsel you will sometimes hate, Ser Barristan said. It demands that you imagine your enemies laughing at you for the strangeness of the men you keep, and that you calculate whether the thought of their laughter puts heat in your cheeks that might cost lives when you decide to silence it. And of him? She asked. It demands that he remember he has already died, Ser Barristan said gently, and that a man who has died once is useful only so long as he can be killed again. He must be willing to be hated for work he does well, and replaced if he does it badly. Replaced by you? Ned asked, a flicker of the old wryness not dead yet. Thank the gods. Replaced by any man who loves you enough to stand where he must stand and not where he wants to, Ser Barristan said simply. The queen's eyes had not left Eddard's. I do not like that you know me, she said. It puts me at a disadvantage. But I have taken worse odds. And I have learned to live with being beholden to strangers because I have very few friends I can afford. If you lie to me, I will know. If you betray me, I will learn it quickly. If you try to save me from knowledge I have a right to, I will call it the same as lying. If you raise your hand to soft cruelty and name it mercy, we are done. If you make me better, I will endure your corrections as I endure the heat in this city, in a temper and yet keeping my crown straight. Do we understand one another, Eddard Stark, who died and did not? He bowed his head a fraction because a larger bow would make it theater. We do. Missandei, send for Grey Worm. Ser Barristan, ask for the one-eared scribe who never forgets a sum. We will formalize what we must. And someone put the goats away before they begin to smell like dragons. Eddard Stark, your petition is granted. I will have a hand of the queen who prefers the knife to the sword. He could not help it. He laughed then softly. It is a heavy ring, your grace. Wear it gently. The first thing he learned about the work was that there was too much of it. Mercy required paper. Judgment ate ink. He had passed, in what felt like a day that was 27 hours long, through rolls listing the names of freedmen entitled to rations, petitions for redress from merchants whose property had been seized in the interregnum and who insisted loudly on compensation that must be calculated for a market in which money itself had shifted, and that hardest of tasks, deciding whether to press a matter where principle was clear and reality would be blood. Missandei's hands moved with a grace that made him feel both clumsy and loved. She had been a slave, and now she corrected his guise with a courtesy that felt like a bomb laid on a burn when he stumbled through a vowel with a root in the back of the throat where old men tend to cough. He proposed that the queen sit in judgment once a week. She could not sit every day or she would never stand. She could not sit never, or men would build myths about her that would poison the city like water left standing in a bowl under sun. In the north he had taught both sons and daughters that a lord's work required hearing voices you did not like and then doing something that none of them liked. He outlined a schedule. Missandei took his words and built them into something that would balance both appearances and the truer thing beneath. Grey Worm listened as if a statue had developed a sense of the comic and was careful not to show it. You are a different sort of hand, Grey Worm said with an immobility that Eddard had discovered meant respect and amusement both. The woman before asked where to put the spears. You ask where to place the mouths. Mouths make spears more efficient, Eddard said. If we know what men hunger for, we can sometimes persuade them to eat what won't ruin them. You are a cook for a city, Missandei said softly. That would be a good epitaph, he said, and she glanced at him. And in her eyes he saw the rope of pity and admiration twisted into one necessary cord. It warmed and pricked him. He began to learn the city's temper. Meereen was a place that had lived under a way so long that the way had built itself into the bones of men who hated it. Eddard had known that sort of place. The north had its own ways, and some of them he loved and some he tolerated and a few he feared because the men who practiced them insisted that their age was proof of their worth. Slavery had been here as long as brick. The queen had cut it root and branch and then discovered that roots and branches have a way of seeding themselves in the air. Freedmen wanted vengeance that looked like justice and justice that felt like vengeance. The men who had owned men wanted courtesy that looked like amnesia. The children wanted food. He found a boy who had been stealing sugar and learned his name and learned his mother's and learned enough to buy the boy honest work carrying messages between the palace and the kitchens for half a month while his mother found her feet in a market where feet slipped. He later learned the boy ran messages for the sons of the Harpy as well, and he did not kill him. He sat with him instead. He told him a story about a wolf that thought it could sit between two packs without choosing until the day came when both packs decided to test its hunger. What happened to the wolf? The boy asked, sullen and enters. Ted, in a way all boys are when the story is old enough to be someone else's. It lived longer than it would have if it had chosen wrong, Eddard said, and shorter than if it had chosen right, but long enough to watch both packs spend themselves. Is that a good ending? The boy asked, skeptical as a boy must be if he is to learn to see lies in pretty coats. It is an ending, Eddard said. Most men do not get those. The Queen's Guard came to like his feet. They said he walked the halls as if the stones might be insulted to be walked on and should be apologized to in the way a man shifts his weight. They teased him for it with the courtesy of men who, being strangers to him and loyal to their queen in a way that made their faces distant to all warmth they did not think she desired, allowed themselves jokes like footnotes. He took it in and sometimes smiled. Ser Barristan spoke to him once in the cool behind a stairway where wind lived like a patient dog. "You will not win here as you won in the north," he said. "Here a man speaks with his hands as much as with his tongue. The old families will smile, and then they will take the moment when you allow your mouth to pull at your lip with honest distaste. That is the piece they will put their fingers under and heave you with." "I know," Eddard said. "In the north they counted a man's distaste proof of his honor. Here it will be counted a proof of insult." "You came here to teach our queen the ways of your home," Ser Barristan said. "You will now have to accept that you will be taught the ways of hers." "You seem pleased," Eddard said wryly. "I am tired," Ser Barristan said, with a candor that endured no interruption. "Pleased belongs to younger men. You are not young, and thank the gods for it." The dragons were a lesson every day. Eddard had never wanted to see what he saw the first time they took to the air when he stood under them. He had wanted to keep the awe and slight contempt he had for legends that hung heavy on men's shoulders without turning their muscles into anything more than posture. He did not get what he wanted. The buzz that ran through a body when a dragon passes overhead is like the breath you do not realize you hold when you lie with a woman you love and she turns to look at you. It makes your heart stupid and your knife slow and your regard simple. He learned to love them. He learned to fear them without letting that fear call itself reverence. He taught himself the names Daenerys had given them. She said them with a mother's care. He said them with the carefulness of a man who knows that names are the strongest rope a man can throw around himself. "Drogon will not wear a collar," she said once in the early evening when the city had not yet decided whether it would cool. "He is all hunger." "Most things are," he said. "We pretend to 100 motives. Strip them. We hunger." "What do you hunger for?" she asked. She asked it not with softness. Softness had never been her weapon, but as a mathematician might ask what sum yields a difficult remainder. "Forgiveness," he said, before he knew it would be a truth. "From whom," he added, "is the problem?" She looked at him as a woman who knows the balance of a question is where its usefulness lies. "I do not forgive myself. It makes me ungenerous with others who seek it. The solution to that is not yet evident. You have forgiven this city enough to try to build it. That is a form of loving," he said. "Perhaps," she said, but the refusal to accept comfort nestled in the word like a thorn. They sat in judgment on a heat-heavy morning and for 3 hours heard matters that made all wars look like a kind of clumsy comedy. A woman asked for a judgment about the custody of a child who did not look like either man who claimed to be his father. A baker wished a coin repaid after a sack of flour he had sold arrived home full of beetles, and all winter he had reserves of patience but none of grain. A former pit fighter wished the right to return to the trade that had bought his mother's medicine. He was a good man and wanted to be a good man and swung the weight of both wishes and stood there with fists like terracotta jugs. Daenerys watched each face like one listens to a foreign instrument and then must decide whether it is music. Eddard whispered sometimes. He did not speak over long. He asked more questions than he proposed answers. When the pit fighter finished, Daenerys looked at Eddard and said with a half-smile that he knew must be the shape her anger made when shaped without target. "If I open the pits again, men will say I am weak. If I do not, men will say I hate their history. I must disappoint someone. I prefer to disappoint those who think being pleased is their birthright. Disappoint those who think pleasure is proof of goodness," he suggested. "Which are the same," she said, and turned to the fighter and spoke to him as if there were no one else present. He wrote letters. He wrote to a woman whose hair he remembered the color of leaves when they are still long from falling. He wrote to daughters whose faces he only knew now as the versions of their faces that appeared in his mind when he tried to sleep. He wrote to a boy who was not a boy, whom he had told a lie so enormous that he had grown shoulders to carry it and a heart to shelter it, and now there was a storm named inside him that would either break him or make him the man his mother had asked Eddard to let him be. He kept the letters. He did not send them. He had once sworn to keep a name, and he had kept it. He had come here because keeping it longer would become not fidelity but harm. He waited for the hour when telling would become the only honest thing. It did not come. Every hour is a candidate for wisdom and betrayal both. He spoke with Ser Barristan about Rhaegar. The old knight warmed a degree when memory allowed him to serve a truth. He was a serious boy, he said. He grew into a SC.
Riosman.
He read too many sad songs and thought their sadness was the measure of intelligence. He was intelligent. He was also good, which is not the same. He played the harp and made strong men cry into their cups, and then went to fight as if he had been born knowing the shape of his own death would be dignified and useful. He loved, Eddard said carefully. He did, Ser Barristan said, as men love who have high thoughts about themselves. He loved his people, and he loved his parents, and he loved the idea of justice, and he loved a woman who was difficult for him to love, and he loved another who was easy, and he loved his children in the way a man loves when he thinks everything he has done makes a pattern that excuses what did not fit. Nobody is excused, Eddard said. We excuse the dead as we require, Ser Barristan said, a trace of sharpness. Otherwise we cannot sleep. There was a murder. It had the flavor murders have when they are committed with a purpose and then used to plant other purposes like a garden. Too tidy in the wrong places. An overseer who had become a manager in the New Order fell in an alley where blood should not pool at that hour. Eddard stood at the mouth of that alley and felt again, in heat and dust, the particular cold behind his shoulder blades that comes when a city tells you it has decided to keep some of its secrets to itself. He found marks that might have meant assassins paid by old masters wishing to estrange new rulers from the poorer men who had begun to trust them, and he found marks that might have meant those poorer men had staged evidence of that to create a large reaction to a small cut. He did not chase these to complete conclusion. He had learned that sometimes asking the wrong question harms the right answer. He met with a man who wore a gold mask propped upon his head like a ridiculous crown so he could smoke and spit freely and call himself honest. You sit with me because you prefer to believe your enemies articulate, Eddard said. It flatters you that you imagine you understand them when they speak. You prefer us to be men you can speak to rather than hunger in masks. You prefer farmers, the man replied. We are not farmers here. He had Missandei and Grey Worm teach him how to move in this city the way a fish learns to move in a river that is not its own. He let himself be followed. He let himself be seen speaking to men it would be dangerous to be seen speaking with. He erected a court not under the Queen's eye where men could bring petty suits to sworn listeners who would be paid a fixed rate that did not allow bribery to purchase only certain ears. He posted a list of crimes and their punishments that were not as fierce as the old ways had been and harsher than the comfortable wanted. He saw to grain stores. He saw to latrines. He walked the slave pens after nightfall and forced himself to read the graffiti that appeared on the brick after rain. He watched the Queen sit with children. He watched her fail and be forgiven, and succeed and be suspected. He saw love gather around her in fans and then dry in the air and then be renewed. He remembered a man who had worn a crown he had not entirely respected, and he tried to see in this woman the shape of a monarch he could serve without bending his back lower than necessary. He came to understand that what he admired most in her was not the urge to do good, which many people have and which has made much of the world terrible. He admired her capacity to listen when it hurt and to be corrected when it stung. There were nights when he stood on the upper terrace and watched heat lightning perpetually flick its cloth over the desert, and thought of Winterfell as if it were a word he had not said in too long and was afraid of mispronouncing now if he tried. Meereen's darkness was a sarong wrapped around hills that refused to be hills and insisted on being piles of brick. The desert beyond was a sheet taught to make children's beds believe in order. The Queen would join him sometimes, not because she wanted to be soothed, but because she had decided that silence in company was the last luxury a sovereign could afford. Tell me why I cannot do what I want, she said once, without irony. Because what you want changes, he said. Because what you want frightens you and you make it angrier by telling yourself fear is weakness. Because if you punish a city for the appetite of a moment, the city will punish you for your next. Because you are not yet strong enough to survive the result of your own impatience. Because you are too strong to be excused from learning patience. She grunted, a sound that was both feminine and not. My dragons are peaceable when fed, she said. As are we all, he said. Our task is to feed our wants in a way that does not starve someone else's children. You speak as if you have done only that all your life, she said, and he accepted the hard observation like a nail through a board. I have starved others' children by giving the wrong man the wrong right, he said. I have learned to count again. I will fail again. I prefer to fail in ways that cost less blood. They were interrupted by the arrival of a messenger from Yun Kai. He was dressed in yellow and the assurance of a man who believed the laws of commerce older than any queen, and he carried papers that demanded Daenerys release certain ships and pay certain tariffs or gods and governments would be offended. Eddard said nothing as she read. He said nothing as she crumpled a page and then, having looked at him, uncrumpled it and smoothed it on the table and weighted it down with the bone weight some craftsman had shaped into a laughing jackal. What do you suggest? She asked finally, when she had mastered her face. If you refuse entirely, you will have war and perhaps merit it, he said. If you agree entirely, you will have stability and likely regret it. Offer to pay but not to release the ships until escorted by our own men and our own law to the mouth of the bay, where they may then pretend we did not embarrass them. Offer a sum that makes them feel both tricked and respected. You are against war? She asked. I am against wars that break your attention when your attention is required elsewhere, he said. I do not know yet where your attention will be required more. It may be this city. It may be the sea. The sea leads to Westeros, she said lightly, and he felt his breath stick again. The word did that, as a smell does that you have not smelled in 20 years, and that is the smell of something you are not sure you ever wanted but do not know how to live without. He looked at her and thought of all the men who would kneel to her and then teach her the wrong lessons about that kneeling. You must not think of Westeros as a word for home, he said. It is a word for hunger. If you name a hunger your home, you will arrive and never be full. You speak as if you love it, she said. It should have been contempt. It was curiosity. I do, he said, and his honesty had become a habit here, which pleased him and worried him both. That is why I am so careful to hate it also, with precise measures and regular maintenance. She laughed then, not a large sound but an unguarded one. My hand is a man made of measurements, she said. He accepted the title on his shoulder as one accepts a cloak in summer, with gratitude because to refuse would insult the giver, and with the awareness that bearing it well would require practice not to flinch. He had been a hand before, in a city built of different stone, and the job had broken him quickly. He did not assume a different queen would save him from that danger. He assumed only that he would be asked to break more carefully. There were men who wished to be rid of him. Some were loud and stupid as cocks whose crowing is their only business. Some were quiet. Skahaz Mo Kandak, called the Shave Pate, was loud and clever, and his face was a history written in scars. His head was clean as a blade and his eyes sharp as a polished coin. They sat together like men who might kill one another as an academic exercise if it were not so expensive. You will put rope around this city and call it law, Skahaz said. You will cause us all to choke politely. Better than bleeding for courtesies that do not even supply conversation, Eddard said. You are a man who likes to speak as if the past is a decent witness, Skahaz said with a lazy contempt. My past had me in chains. Your past had you counting the barrels of barley in your pretty stronghold. I will not learn your lessons easily. Good, Eddard said. Hard learnings last longer. You look like a man who needs a knife in the dark, Skahaz said after a long time, and it was almost a compliment. I am a man who needs such men to believe I have knives in the light, Eddard said. Skahaz grunted. That we can manage, he said. He and Missandei built a council that had no name so that men could pretend it was not a council. They put around the queen a ring of thought, and set in that ring men who disliked each other with cordial intensity and women whose patience for masculine displays was minimal. Dario Naharis, when present, traced lines on maps with the point of a long nail and smiled as if the city were a lover he was tired of and would bed again if she would only change her perfume. Eddard disliked him and respected him the way one respects a well-made but unnecessary weapon. Jorah Mormont was gone by then, exiled for the small and large ways a man deceives himself into thinking surveillance is a form of loyalty. Daenerys spoke of him rarely, and when she did it was as one speaks of a wound that healed into a weather knuckle. "What would your wife think of all this?" Daenerys asked once, not impatiently. "She would say I am doing work that suits me and that it will kill me slower than other kinds," he said. "She would tell me to drink water and not pride. She would not be jealous," the queen said. She had learned to name that demon without inviting it. "She had too much to be jealous of," he said gently. "Jealousy is a luxury of those who have time." They spoke sometimes very carefully about children. Her voice when she named them was not the voice with which she commanded dragons. It had different salt. He did not ask how each had died. She did not ask how his had been kept from death. Once, when the day had been a cascade of small stupidities they had both bridled at and endured, she said into the evening, "I will not bear a child." And the words were straight iron. "I will not speak of it often. It makes men foolish and makes women foolish, and I am tired of both." "You will reign," he said. "I will end," she said. "You could take a child," he said, careful. "Make him or her yours by law and love." "There is no law here yet that is mine," she said. "Love I can bargain for in time, but it is not a coin I can command in a tariff." She turned her head and her face was a map that had been changed mid-campaign. "But I have thought of it." He said nothing. The name in his throat sat like a stone in a riverbed. He could pick it up and skip it, and it would cut the water satisfyingly and then be lost, or he could leave it and let the river do the work stones always ask of it. He did not then, because whatever else he was, he had learned to keep the promises that defined him, and if he could not keep them perfectly, he could at least keep them until keeping them would mean a larger betrayal. In the thick underbelly of the city, men wore gold masks and told themselves they were the ancient ones preserved in a jar of honey, still sweetened by their own importance. Eddard had no patience for men who kept their faces in jars. He set a price on masks. He asked that those who wore them remove them in court. He asked that those who would negotiate with him show their mouths. Ash. He was not naive. He knew a man can smile with his eyes. But he wanted the habit. He wanted the ritual. He knew that sometimes the only way to teach a city to love a thing is to make it perform that love and then hope that the heart follows the hand. He had held Caitlyn's hand long enough to know that sometimes the habit of touching was all that kept a marriage good through bitter winters. A caravan from the north of Slaver's Bay staggered into the city one afternoon, and with it came a man whose hair had been corn once and was now straw. He had walked as long as he had been allowed, and then he had been dragged the rest. He was a man no one would have asked to tell a story if he had sat in a tavern in the Riverlands in a better year, and he brought news that shook Eddard like a fever that does not break. "Ships in the narrow sea," the man said. "A dragon banner raised far west." Later, alone, Eddard let himself remember a boy with a wolf's face and a laugh that came easily when it came at all, and he let himself imagine his daughters as he had not allowed himself to imagine them for 2 years. Alive in a soft place with wool enough and the smell of stewed apples for an evening worth the name. He had learned not to hope for specifics, because specifics were how hope made hallways for despair to walk. He allowed himself a general longing, and then, because he was a sensible man and had learned to be his own jailer, he shut it away. Daenerys asked him what he would do if she asked him to leave the city now and make her case in the West without her. He did not hate her for the cruelty. He loved her for the courage. "Who would I be if I left?" he asked. "You would be as your reputation says," she said, eyes cool. "A man who keeps his word to his friend until it kills him, and keeps his promise to his sister until it kills him again. You would be a man who dies and does not." "And you?" he asked. "I would be a woman who sends a man into the past to harvest it for her and hopes his hands are good and does not insult him by telling him not to stay in the fields," she answered. He thought of ravens, of letters written in a hand that did not shake, of a boy with a sword he had watched once, twice, in the courtyard while snow fell melting on the leather of his jerkin. He thought of a name he had called to that boy across a yard that had not been the name the boy owned. He thought of telling this queen this secret and making her life and the boy's life and the life of an entire realm swing like a pendulum for the pleasure of perhaps a truer truth. He thought of all that and said, finally, "No, no." She took it without injury. I will not leave you until the city can be left without it killing you to go. If that day never comes, then I will die here, and it will be a decent and undistinguished grave. You are a hand and not a friend, she said, and it was not accusation. It was relief. I am both, he said, but the order matters. It was not an unending rise. There were reverses, as there are always reverses. A storehouse burned, and with it 3 weeks' grain for a district that had been slowly learning to love the queen for her boring competence in matters that do not make legends. A child died who had run messages for Eddard and for other men both, and the city discovered once again how quickly rhetoric feeds on the dead. The sons of the Harpy killed, again, in the one place in the city Eddard had thought secure for rail-thin lads with quick hands and for women in white who gathered laundry and news with equal skill. He took the shame in. He did not hide it. He did not dramatize it. He found the men who had opened the gate in that alley, and he hanged them where the wind struck that corner and made whistling happen, and he wrote a letter of apology to the mother and sent it with coin. He wished often then that there were another way to repair the world than coin and blood. He had learned late that there are not many. For a week the queen did not ask his counsel before she acted. He let her not ask. He went about his work and was useful and offered no shape for her rage to be poured into like wine. Then she came to his chamber, not late but when the air had the color of late on it, and she said, I know what you will say. And then she said what he would have said, but differently. He nodded, and the nod stood like a post in a field where fences can be strung later. You grew up under a man who never learned to listen, she said. Is that why you speak softly? I speak softly because men use volume as a weapon, and I have found it less effective than they believe, he said. I speak softly because when I shouted once, I lost what I wanted to keep. I speak softly because it forces the other to come closer if they wish to hear. You are a strategist of breath, she said. You are a strategist of flame, he said, and the compliment pleased her enough that she did not smile. He visited the fighting pits when they were empty. He walked the oval and felt an old animal tug at his spine. Men had consented to die for money and attention here. Men had been forced to die for the same. Men had killed boys because some towns survive on bread and some on spectacle, and the bread had not been enough to make anyone forget their own emptiness. He did not like the place. He did not like forbidding other men what he did not like. He did not like forbidding other men something that might keep them from stabbing him. He advised openings with rules. He made himself write those rules, and he made them hard to love. The queen took them and removed 3 rules that were stupid, 2 that were cruel in the way gentleness sometimes is when it is stupid, and left the rest. He received a letter with the smell of wet stone on it, as if the hand that had held it had been near water and weather. It came via 3 men whose faces were only faces he would never see again. Inside it, in a hand that made no apologue. Yes, for being the hand of a woman who had known temper and self-education both, there was a sentence that took his heart and put it down and picked it up again and then put it down where it had found it. Your son is a man and keeping promises like a man, it said. The letter did not say which son. He did not need it to. The rest of the letter was about cousins and wolves and winter stores and all the things a woman writes to the man she is not sure is alive when she keeps writing to him in her head anyway, and that she finally writes when someone suggests perhaps a raven could fly farther than she had imagined. He put the letter in a place where his hand would find it when fear did what fear does best at 3 in the morning. He had feared that naming himself would bring daggers in a quantity too large to dodge. He discovered that the men who would have killed him were split between those who remembered the rebellion as a story in which he was a villain, and those who had learned that killing a man who sat at a queen's right hand would earn them not romance but prompt instruction in the quality of Myreen's rope, which under his oversight had improved by a factor he took no pride in. He lived. He performed the ordinary miracles politicians must perform when they are not magicians. He made 2 men agree who had no reason to agree. He reduced the speed of blood in one small district by a measurable amount. He bought time. He learned to value time as the only currency that mattered when dealing with history. There was a day when Daenerys, without preface, said, "I know you keep something from me large enough to be furniture." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "And you will tell me when?" And he said, "When telling it becomes kinder than carrying it." and she allowed herself the smallest noise of disgust at that kind of sentence and then allowed herself the larger, more generous acceptance of it. After, he went to the terrace and stood in the heat that had learned how to stand more properly on his skin, and whispered a name to the brick. He was a man who refused superstition only when it was fashionable. He had become, in his age, respectful of ghosts. When the Yunkish returned with their fleet and their preposterous warriors whose hair moved like fields in wind, when the city gathered itself like a cat that is trying to look uninterested and cannot entirely manage it, when the queen stood on the pyramid and the city looked up as if expecting her to change the weather with her arms, Eddard stood at her left and did not touch his sword in the dramatic fashion men sometimes practice when they think onlookers might find it comforting. He had learned to exact from his body the kind of stillness that communicates a well of patience. He listened to the list of demands. He advised the forms of refusal. Daenerys used half of each. It was a good policy. It angered everyone and satisfied enough. On a morning when the sky had decided to practice being gray, which here meant heat in a different suit, he found himself speaking to the dragons as if they were horses who might be convinced to accept a bit by argument. He told them a story about a wolf and a dragon and a winter that was not a winter because heat eats winter when winter appears out of season. He told them about the snow he expected never to feel again. He listened without believing for an answer. He heard nothing but the shift of heavy muscle and the sight of an eye that measured him with an interest he was ashamed to find flattering. Daenerys came to him quietly that afternoon. She had worked out a tone to use with him when she meant to be ordinary. "I have decided," she said. "About which of the 100 matters drooling for your decision?" he asked mildly. "The one that will erase my excuses," she said. "We will go to Westeros when the city can bear my leaving. There. I have said it in a way that commits me to a kind of patience I do not possess." She put her hands on the table as if to steady the decision with her palms. "When we go, I will need Westermen who trust my justice more than they fear my dragons. I have one such now." She glanced up at him. "Two, perhaps, counting Ser Barristan. He is old. You are not young. I will need younger men to be infected with your particular disease. This insistence on decency even when it is not fashionable. You will help me find them or make them." He had expected this. He had hoped for it with care. The way a man hopes a wound will scar clean rather than fester. "I will," he said simply. She looked at him a time, and then away, and then at him again, as if she had to convince herself that a thing her eyes did of their own accord could be allowed to continue. "The men who love me for the wrong reasons are going to be in abundance I will never be rid of," she said with a half-grin he had learned to count as generosity. "The men who love me for the right ones I will fear. I will test them. I will suspect them when I am hurt. It is not flattering to tell you this. It is comforting," he said. "It tells me you are armed where it matters." She nodded. "And you?" she said briskly, a change of subject that was not. "You might tell me your furniture." His breath went out of him. He had prepared himself so often for this hour that the hour itself felt like a friend he had delayed greeting. He sat. He placed his hands on the table the way she had placed hers. He looked at them as if they belonged to a man who might do wrong if he looked away. "There is a boy," he said. He watched her mouth not move. "Not a boy. He is a man now. He was born to a prince and his aunt. He is a secret I am tired of, and a person I am not entitled to be tired of. He has been my son and not all his life. I have protected him by lying to him, and I am not proud of that. He is a Stark by habit and a Targaryen by blood. He is your kin." Daenerys did not move for a long time. He had thought the word kin would do something IMM. Ediate to her face. He had underestimated her. When she spoke it was lightly, as one tests the strength of a rope by pulling and then not. "My brother's son," she said. "He was a poet. He did not always love wisely." "He loved," Eddard said. "He would not judge. He had learned not to judge what he had helped make dangerous." "What is his name?" she asked. He said it. The brick listened. She blew out a breath. It sounded almost like a laugh and not at all like one. "Of course," she said. "It would be like that. Tall, dark, a healer of dogs and a breaker of vows. Tall, Eddard said. Dark, honest as a small fire you can keep your hands over. Torn as old cloth. Does he want a crown? She asked. No, Eddard said. He wants quiet, which is why one day he will wear something heavy against his will. That is how crowns work, she said. This is not a surprise. She stood. She walked to the terrace. She looked at a city that had learned to say her name without choking. She placed her hands on the stone and did not squeeze. Thank you, she said, to the air, which was in the habit of taking such words for itself. Later she turned and smiled with a little slice of malice meant for Aerys's memory and other ghosts. We will see which of us is the true Targaryen, she said. And he could not help loving her then, as a man loves a falcon he knows he cannot teach to come back every time and does not want to. He did not sleep that night. He had freed something in himself, and now it ran circles in his head like a dog that had waited all day. He lay in the heat and thought of snow. He thought of his sister and the bed and the blood and the promise, and he allowed himself to know something he had not known the night he left that room. That promises given to the dying are a form of theft. They steal from the living the right to adapt. The next day Daenerys came to him with a list of names and a map that had been worked over so hard its edges looked gnawed. We will build the bridge we need, she said. We will make Meereen less hungry. We will make your boy hungry for justice more than for quiet. We will make a path through the men in the west who would burn us if they could, and we will make sure the only fire is ours and that we use it as a light. She placed her finger on a point on the map where the sea narrowed. Here, she said, is where fear becomes use. That is my gift. Your gift is to make it legal. She looked up with the expression she wore when the morning was going to be long and satisfying. We will begin. He wrote until his hand cramped. He read until his eyes felt like men beaten with sticks. He listened until silence itself began to sound like a sound. He ate when Missandei put a dish at his elbow that he could lift with a quill still in his hand. He sometimes slept in his chair with his chin a weight on his chest, and he would wake to find a blanket over his knees, placed by no one, placed by everyone. He lived, as he had always lived, by making himself useful and trying to become invisible in his usefulness. It never worked. Men look at the man a queen trusts the way dogs look at a man with bread. Skahaz brought him news. The harpy cuts her hair, he said, pleased with himself. He meant that the old families who had used the gold masks to feel ancient had stopped one foolishness to make room for another. They learn. So will we, Eddard said. Grey Worm smiled one of his invisible smiles in the way a small shift of posture becomes an acknowledgement when men have been taught not to express and then find expression anyway because they are not wood. The hand is not so heavy as the last man who ruled us, he said. The hand is softer, Missandei corrected. Not lighter. Daenerys rode through the city on a morning of fools. Children had fashioned masks not of gold but of bread crusts and clay and wore them tilted off to show their eyes and the joy in them. Men had painted their wives' palms with henna that would stain for a week and remind them of this morning once dishes were again the only work. The queen nodded to a woman with a loaf on her head and a baby on her hip and a husband at her elbow to keep balance, not for the loaf which would not fall, but for the day which would. Eddard watched the woman's mouth open a little as a person's mouth opens when they realize the person on the horse is looking at them and no one else. He thought of finding his daughters in a crowd and making his face quiet so that their hearts would not leap too high and fall when he was called away. He thought of sons and the hard bargain they make with their fathers, to be made by them and to must exceed them. In the afternoon they argued. They did. It had been a long time coming. The palace was learned in the way voices ricochet when two minds both accustomed to command and to correction decide to test where the other's iron lies. He told her not to open a gate. She opened it. He told her to punish a man away. She punished him another. He told her that fear was a tool to be held by the handle and not the blade. She took it in her hand and bled and did not show him the blood. He said nothing then because he had earned the right to be silent. They stood long at opposite windows and did the city the courtesy of not making it listen to their stubbornness. Then she turned, as it is often the duty of the sovereign to turn first. You will be right less often when we go west, she said. Your north is not the truth of all places. I do not expect to be right often, he said. I expect only to be heard. If you hear me and do otherwise and we live, I will not complain. If you do otherwise and we die, I will be dead and so will you and thus beyond complaint. The small twist of his mouth stole the sting. She looked at him long in a way that would have humiliated him once and now only reminded him that he would not be allowed the privacy he had wasted in youth. You are the best mistake I have, Ma. Duh, she said, and the best choice. He opened his mouth and closed it, and that was eloquence enough. A letter came in from the ports of Volantis, written in a hand that enjoyed itself too much and leaned forward on the page as if the letters themselves were eager to be what they were, announcing a movement of ships whose flags were not yet declared and whose bills of lading were nonsense. Eddard put it alongside others. He began to map the ways men prepared to lie. He began to write, with Missandei's help, the laws for a city that would need to endure without its queen if it was to endure with her. He wrote mildly radical things in plain language. He wrote that if a man took a wife by force, he would lose not only his freedom but his name in Meereen, and that names would be given to the city to be used for grain ships and schools. He wrote that the children of those who had been chattel would be recognized as citizens if they were born under a day sky within the sound of the city's bells. He wrote that merchants who attempted to bind debtors beyond 7 years would be considered slavers in court. He wrote that the queen's justice was swift when she had time for swiftness, but when she did not, her officers would not hang men to feed rumor. It was not glorious. It was the boring work by which a realm survives. He loved it a little for that. He had loved the boring work in Winterfell because it made the interesting work possible. He loved it here because it taught him, finally, that his late wisdom had survived his earlier death. He visited the dragons less, because he feared that his awe would beginning to say yes in him to things that should be told no. He watched the queen visit them more, because she loved them and needed them, and because when she was with them she was most herself, a woman unafraid of her own force. He did not ask her to be less. He counseled her how to be directed. She did not always thank him. He did not require thanks. He required only evidence that his words were put in the balance and not immediately dismissed because they were heavy and old. At the end of a day that had lasted 2, he watched her fall asleep upright with her head on the arm of a chair each time Missandei stopped reading a petition, and he watched her wake each time without making anyone feel small who had witnessed it. He covered her with a cloak and pretended not to notice when Ser Barristan pretended not to notice him doing it. He stood at a window and looked out at a city that was beginning to offer itself to hope the way a dog that has been beaten offers its head to a palm, both craving and flinching at the same time. He allowed himself a measured satisfaction. He allowed himself, for the first time in too long, to anticipate a winter that would be a winter again and not only a metaphor for death. The sound of wings came soft as breath. Drogon passed the window and was gone. A black letter of a language the world had nearly forgotten and was afraid to learn again. Eddard watched the line he left intend the air, and for a moment, long enough for a man to think a thought and then put it away, he felt young enough to imagine that all this, the queen and the city and the seas that would open and close, were part of a patience the world had been practicing on him. He breathed. He put his hand on the sill. The stone was warm. He thought, not for the first time, that heat had its own morality. Perhaps he could learn it before he died. He would die. He had already. What remained was to do his work with a decency that would leave room in the air for those who would come after to breathe without choking on his mistakes. So he returned to the table, took up the quill that had been his sword for so long he had forgotten to give it an honorific, and wrote as the city slept and woke and dreamed of law. The queen slept with her head turned to the warm rest of the chair and woke without apology. He did not dream of snow. He put the name he had spoken the day before back into the box in his mind he had made for precious things that required time. He would open it again. He would. He had learned that honor is not a posture but a schedule. On the step outside his chamber he found a pile of peeled pomegranates, placed with the kind of ceremony that belongs only to small jokes done by people who trust you. He smiled at it, slow, and bit into one as if it were a sour apple from a northern tree. Juice ran down his wrist. He licked it off and tasted in it both bitter and sweet. He liked what that taught. He went back to work. The city breathed. The sea held its old argument with the shore. And the queen, who had learned to share her power with weather and paper, opened her eyes and asked for him by his name. He came when she called and found her awake beyond the eyes. There is a way a sovereign looks when sleep has put its weight down on the shoulders and the mind refuses to lie under it. He knew it because he had lived it. She was not tired of waking. She was tired of asking the world to be woken. "You told me a name," she said without greeting. "It has not left my mouth. It will not. You have the virtue, Eddard, of making secrets feel like work rather than drama." "They are work," he said. "Drama is free and costs dearly." She nodded at that with a sort of sour pleasure. "If there is a nephew to be reckoned with," she went on, "there is precedent to be weighed, and men in the West who will pretend not to hear me unless I speak that old language of blood with perfect grammar. For now I will not learn the full declension. I will keep the noun in my pocket until the sentence requires it." "Good," he said. "Words used early are hostages. We must not ransom ourselves to a story before we have built its walls." She studied him, the way she studied maps, with mistrust for the flattering lies that edges tell. "I will need letters," she said. "I will need messengers whose faces say everything X. Point their business. Choose me 3. Grey Worm will dislike disguising men as less than soldiers," he said. "Skahaz will want the opposite, to put more knives into this than the task requires. Missandei will construct a grammar of messenger that will travel well. I will be the ungenerous judge who refuses all good options until we have one that might live." "You have the ugliest metaphors," she said, amused despite all of it. "I was schooled by pigs and winter," he said, and that solved her smile entirely. The work that followed was mostly counting disguised as judgment. He learned to weigh the price of a man's loyalty against the cost of his silence when silence was all a city might afford. He sent for a fisherman who had navigated the currents between Dragonstone and Duskendale and asked him how the sea felt in his hands and whether he had sons on any coast who would be seized if he carried letters that smelled like treason. He spoke to a woman who ran a dye shop that collected gossip like silk collects heat and asked her whether her trips to the river could be made to include a courier's detour without unbalancing her marriage. He asked Missandei to suggest 3 young men whose hunger did not sing too loudly, who could walk among free companies and not look like prayer. It took a week to find one, 2 weeks to dismiss 2, another to accept that the woman with the dye stains on her thumbs would always be a better messenger than the boy, who kept his eyes proud and could not yet learn to lower them. "Take them yourself," Skahaz said when the list lay on the table like a miscounted hand of cards. "Do not trust the city with this. A Westerosi secret wants Western air." "I will not leave," Eddard said, and Skahaz showed his teeth in a shape too sharp to be pleasure. "Your stubbornness feeds your legend," the Shave Pate said. "Legends are a diet for children. Very well. I will lend you men who can become the color of a wall. You may pretend you do not know they are there." "I do not pretend," Eddard said. "Pretend belongs to story, not to ledger. But I will allow it a seat in the back of the room." He sat with Missandei until candles fought their last and lost. They composed letters that had to say everything and nothing both. Missandei wrote in the lucid Myrinese that reduced carving to breath. Eddard added the common in a hand that had not much improved even when the world demanded it. He named no names beyond the dead and the obvious. He invoked laws old enough to be unscanless. He promised nothing but scrutiny and the chance to be heard. He ended each letter with a courtesy that did not bow too low, and a phrase that belonged to no house but might remind any man who had called a winter holdfast home that provision mattered more than pride. When the letters left, the city did not notice. The city did what cities do. It ground grain and gossip. Eddard returned to the business of building a life that could survive a sea change. He met with a woman of the old families who wore wealth like a scarf half forgotten on her shoulders and intelligence like a dagger tucked into that scarf for company. Her name was Orzamo Racker, and she had the exact amount of contempt for the queen that polite men allow themselves to feel toward whether irritation at an inconvenience that would not be moved by complaint but might be lessened by a clever sale. "You bring with you stiff ideas," she said, sitting in shade as if shade were owed to her. "And a stiffer face. Both will crack. I would like to see which pieces are useful." "Pieces are for men who admire puzzles," Eddard said. "I admire tables that do not wobble." "You are right," she said, surprising him by not arguing a thing she could have made a parade of. "Stability is politics' most indecent secret. It wins more loyalties than victory. I am a woman of the old city, Lord Stark. I do not love this queen. I love what can be kept. I have married 3 times. I know that love is not what keeps a household fed. An agreement about cleaning and sleep does. If I told you I would like the pits open again because my nephews eat when others cheer, would you call me cruel? I would call you honest," he said, "and then ask how you intend to keep those nephews from being what the pits make of boys who begin as good men." Her mouth twitched. "You are rude. That will preserve us both. I bring you a list," she added, and produced one from a little roll she wore at the hip in a pouch that knew how to be inconspicuous. "These are the old families who will pay their taxes without argument if you arrange protections for their caravans and a right to petition, with dignity, a magistrate who understands their trade. They will withhold and poison if you do not. Consider this truth a dowry. The gift in exchange? You allow me to be on one of the councils whose existence you deny in public." "I do not deny them," he said. "I insist they have no name." "And I insist that I have one," she said. "You may call me Orze there. That will make the old men angry. It comforts me to think of it." She became, in time, a useful, irritating presence. She had the gift dangerous to men like Eddard who preferred their corrections soft. She was right too often and enjoyed it without apology. She and Skahaz disliked each other with an efficiency that made meetings shorter than they might have been. Missandei turned their phrases into something flat enough to lie in a ledger without burning a hole. Grey Worm listened and never told anyone which parts of the plan he intended to break on purpose if city safety required it. Daenerys learned to let the fighter and the knife and the clerk and the lord hold the same rope and pull in different ways without snapping it. Eddard watched her do it and understood that the task he had taken had become less about telling her what to do and more about choosing which parts of herself to trust most in which hour. He forced the city to mac. He knew habits. He ordered that market weights be tested every first day of the new moon at 3 fixed stations with 3 fixed inspectors whose names were posted in public and therefore whose bribery would cost more. He made families register apprenticeships longer than a year. If the master beat a boy beyond a mark described in patient specifics by Missandei's careful law, the apprenticeship was void. He built a little house of adjudication near the old slave exchange and staffed it with 3 freed women whose reputations were that particular combination of fond and stern that community life grudgingly esteems. He paid them the same wage as a city guard, and he was careful to tell them so, and to tell the city so. He assigned Unsullied not merely to patrol but to stay and listen. He gave them the right to warn without writing, to write without punishment, and to suggest without being laughed from the room. He created an office for complaints with a brazier to burn lies in. He discovered that the brazier was used mostly to warm old men's hands and remind them someone would be offended if they told the truth. He did not mind. Sometimes heat is enough. He went, one evening, at Missandei's urging, to a little hall in the Eastern District where freedmen had been meeting to teach their children letters. Missandei stood before the few and read a story from the old tongue that had been cleaned of its filth. A parable about a jackal who counted each night the number of steps to a well and measured his thirst accordingly. The children listened with the particular rapture of those whose ears have not yet learned to mock. Eddard spoke after, clumsy in the low giskery that Missandei allowed him to risk. He told them a silly story about snowflakes and fencing, about the first time he had seen a summer child try to walk over a pond and discovered ice is both marvel and liar. He kept his voice steady, his mouth slow. He did it unwell. He did it sincerely. The room forgave skill when it could see that sincerity that does not flatter is another word for respect. When he left, the oldest of the 3 freed women judges stopped him by his sleeve, and with the authority of someone who had been a nurse to 4 masters and had kept 3 children alive through 6 winters, she said, "You must leave with a joke when you make a room serious. Otherwise fear rides home on men's shoulders. Learn that. I am trying, he said. You are succeeding, she said. Do not relax. Success ruins men. Dario returned from a foray with the swagger of a man who had slept in 7 beds and decided none had yet learned his precise taste. He dragged with him 3 sellswords whose names were not their names and who swore in 5 languages that they had not killed any men for sport except the ones who had begged for it. Daenerys received them as if receiving a potential infection, with interest and care. Eddard watched Dario watch him, and returned the regard without the sexual threat Dario liked to make of all attention. You will never love me, Dario said cheerfully as they passed one another in the courtyard, where men pretended swords and sweat were politics. I have loved men like you, Eddard said. I am wiser now. You are bleeding me of my fun, Dario complained without injury. But you are making a queen out of a girl. That makes you two both more attractive, which is annoying. Men who call women girls insult themselves at speed, Eddard said, and did not slow. He had learned not to offer more time to men who thought their charm was currency. He fell ill once, which his pride refused to call illness for 3 days until his body told him more plainly that it would not be argued with. He sat at table and discovered that letters rearranged themselves without consulting him and that his breath had become a coin someone else held. Missandei stopped reading. Daenerys looked over with that keen distaste she reserved for betrayal by bodies. You will lie down, she said, and he did what she told him because he had learned not to die for style. He slept and woke and slept again. He dreamed of frost on a windowsill he had scraped with a knife with a boy's pride when he was 10. He dreamed of Catelyn counting without looking. He dreamed of Arya with her hair all angles and of Sansa at an embroidery frame that she had turned into a vice for her frustrations. He dreamed of a boy who was not a boy any longer, who stood in a snow-swept yard with a sword that cut more than air. He woke to Missandei's voice, patient, reading petitions in the next room as if the right ordering of arguments might calm fever. He woke to Grey Worm standing just inside the door with a spear and an expression like a stone does its best to cultivate when it wishes to console a man. Unable, principled. He woke to Ser Barristan's silence, which was a gift of itself, and a bowl of broth he did not count because he knew the counting would shame him. When he rose, there were more letters than he had the patience to hate. He read them all. He found in them the past trying to reestablish itself with modesty. He taught himself to respond to modest men with speed and to grand men with delays and questions. He let Orsay and the judges and Missandei quarrel in sight of petitioners. He forced every quarrel to end with a shared piece of bread, because men will tolerate losing arguments so long as their hands are busy. He learned, again, the extent to which government is a theater and understood that theater is not a dirty word if every actor knows the audience and the rafters are the same men. There were nights when the queen went to the dragons and did not come back sweet-tempered. There were mornings when common flame sharpened into something less promising. He spoke to her then, as one speaks to a friend who has been given a weapon that loves its own sound. Gently, without equivocation, with respect enough to say no. She took that as she took heat. Tea made her flush and sharpen, and then, later, it made her pay attention. They speak to me, she said once, that odd unsoft voice she reserved for matters of bone. Not in words. I would not insult you with that fantasy, but they make shapes in me. Are you afraid of that? I am afraid of men who claim to understand their power perfectly, he said. I am relieved that you do not. As for the rest, yes, I am afraid because fear tells a man where to stand. It keeps me near the door when I must be. You are unromantic, she said. I am married, he said before thought could save him. He felt her look, and he accepted it. The new coin came to him like an interruption and turned out to be a relief. Missandei had put it to him as a question that did not need answering. A city with new laws should have money that says so in metal. Eddard took to the task with unwell joy. He met with divers and men whose hammers had known luxury. He met with women who had kept their glass bracelets through 3 sacking and new value and symbol the way a swimmer knows a current. He suggested one side carry the old glyph that meant city. Missandei suggested the other carry a cipher for freedom that did not insult anyone. Daenerys refused her own likeness. Eddard did not argue, but when the first copper discs cooled and he held one, and saw Sun catch an abstract of a dragon that looked nothing like hers and everything like the idea of courage cleaned of appetite, he understood something that would be quoted later as wisdom and had only been relief. A crown survives better on coins than on the head. He handed the first 15 to Grey Worm. "Pay soldiers last," he said. "But pay them. They would serve if unpaid," Grey Worm said. "For a month," Eddard said. "And we require years." He and Orze went to a public bathhouse together, not as a pleasure but as a test of a law. Women protested and then did not, seeing Missandei with him and a scribe whose one ear made murals of the room's sounds, and Grey Worm at the door. He sat behind a screen that allowed him not to make the room perform cowardice in order to make him comfortable. He listened to the city. A man shaved another man's head and spoke of the price of sesame oil, as if the queen had raised it with malice. A woman complained that her child now thought himself important because a judge had spoken to him twice. A teen fixed his jaw and, in that shape, promised revenge on a man who had laughed when he missed a step. His friend told him to eat first. Eddard allowed himself to enjoy the way men are lovelier when they do not intend to be. He left a coin. He did not leave a lecture. Missandei approved. Some work is accomplished by shutting one's mouth. The pox came up from the docks the way pox comes always. Humbly, arrogantly. The first spots appeared on a teamster whose wife washed clothes for the unsullied. The second on a girl who sold trinkets that broke when children took them home but were cheap enough to forgive. The third on a small man who had never been sick in his life and so caught it like a child. Eddard recognized it the way old hands recognize a knife by the cut. He had watched a fever move through a northern village once and learned that the price of giving men freedom from sickness is to insult them with commands. He placed guards. He paid the wife to stay home. He sent Grey Worm not for arrests but for water barrels. He went himself to a neighborhood where the women held rags over their mouths and the men were embarrassed to be seen afraid. He spoke low. He told dull truths. He flattered no one. He made a town crier of Missandei for a day because her voice was clear and devoid of false urgency. He argued with a priest of a local god who insisted the illness was the queen's fault until the man made a mistake and used the word curse like a weapon. And Eddard placed a hand on his arm and said softly, "You will convert blame into a plague of your own if you do not leave men's fear alone." He did not order. He asked. The priest, affronted by the lack of a stage, left. The pox took its due and then, finding the city unwilling to donate larger opportunities, dwindled. Eddard wrote the names of the dead and had them read aloud without rank attached. He kept it from being a parade because grief is not entertainment. He counted again the cost of letting men gather, and he did not shy from it. He brought Daenerys to a meeting with broom makers because a city is its floors. The men were surly from heat and pride, and because their small craft had kept streets tidy when kings ignored them and queens made it fashionable to notice. He let them insult royal attention. He let them swarm Missandei with practical questions about bristles and export fields. He listened when a boy who had lost 2 fingers to a wedge in a wheel asked if he could still work. He watched the woman who was his mother take his wrist gently when he tried to hide the stump. He said, "The city will pay you to sweep where men bleed." And the woman said, "We always do." And he loved her for it in the way a man loves strangers for sentences that save him time. There was a night almost made for poetry when a wind reminded Meereen that air can move without being pushed. Daenerys used it as if she had conjured it. She took a walk through the district that had given her the worst time, and she did not bring a dragon. She did what she had learned in these months. She brought a bowl of dates from the palace kitchens and a jug of watered wine, and she sat on a doorstep with her sandals off as if she incurred no danger because she belonged. Men came. Women stayed and watched and then inched closer and did not know they had done it until they were near enough for their children to put sticky hands on the foot of a queen. Eddard stood a small distance off with Grey Worm and a scribe and 2 men who had learned to be invisible by losing everything worth being seen for. He watched it like weather. He told himself to remember everything about her posture, the particular line of her back when she laughed and then quieted, the way she moved her hand like a small blade when cutting a remark into a shape that would not offend. It was a small demonstration, and later, some fool would write of it as if it had saved the city. It did not save. It put one more stone in the causeway they were building. He went home and slept without dreaming, which was rarer than men allowed themselves to say. The incident at the pit came as if in reward for such quiet strides. He had argued against the timing like a man argues with the day. It will end and begin again whether you consent to it or not. He had shaped the rules. He had insisted on layers of guards whose eyes had been trained to look at mouths when men speak and at hands when they do not. He had blocked junk sellers from approaching the stands with their tatters of knives. He had banned certain powders. He had required, in a gesture the fighters thought sissy until he explained it to them, that every man who entered the fighting list spit in a bowl, and that the spit be examined by a healer who knew the look of certain poisons. He had done all that, and still the city sought blood the way dry brick seeks water. In the third bout of the afternoon, a dancer of blades from some city named with too many L's, and one of the new pit fighters whose fists had been his tutor, closed in a shower of dust that ruined dignity. A man sitting 2 rows below Eddard leaned back in a way no man leaned during a fight when no arrow was coming. It was not the movement that saved Daenerys. It was the absence. The man did not lean as if bumping his friend. He leaned as if making room for a thing that had replaced his fear. Eddard's body moved, and the mind found a reason a step later. He put his shoulder between queen and basket of fresh pomegranates, and the first dart took him above the shoulder blade where old hurts weather badly. It sang like metal does when it enters flesh. Afterward he would be ashamed of the sound he made and then forgive himself. Grey Worm's spear was in the air before Eddard's foot knew where to plant. The scribe with one ear rolled over the queen like a dog guarding its master. Missandei had her hand on Daenerys's wrist, not to pull but to keep her from moving too quickly. The dartman's second shot whistled and would have killed a woman 5 places down if Orze had not stood and slapped the air with a fan too heavy for a fan and knocked it into the aisle, where a 12-year-old with more curiosity than fear picked it up and handed it to the wrong man, who gave it to the right one, who broke it in half efficiently and then wedged the halves under his heel. It did not become a slaughter. It came close to becoming one. The people who had come for spectacle would not be made beasts because of it. Grey Worm made a line of men that was better than a wall because it moved. Eddard stayed upright because that was the job and told Daenerys to go because that was the law. She refused like every good sovereign, and he did not waste a second insisting. He bent, the way men bend when they have been trained not to, and picked up a handful of dust and threw it in a direction exactly calculated to make men look where a man with a gold mask might want them not to look. They looked. The gold masks tried to look like wall and failed. The wall moved and bled and then locked. It was done in seconds. It taught the city a lesson. That rage is not the only answer to fear. Eddard let a healer pour vinegar on a wound that would later itch with pride. He did not make it a story. He made it a shape that fit inside an ordinance about the pits that Missandei wrote with a hand that did not shake at all. The man with the dart was a boy when the mask came off. Eddard asked him his name and heard, in the sound the boy made in reply, a voice that still spoke milk when it said war. Daenerys refused to leave. They stood in a room where the boy's wrists were tied loose because Eddard insisted on it. They asked him who had taught him to shoot. He answered with silence because men sometimes confuse stubbornness with manhood. Eddard took in his age. He looked at his hands, and the mark of a burn healed badly on one, and knew the workshop where such burns are earned. He sat on a stool because standing over a boy is a lie. He said, in a tone he had used with Robb when the boy thought his strength would armor his mistake, "Did you mean to kill me?" The boy seemed surprised to be included. It made Eddard's chest hurt more than the wound in his shoulder. "No," he said, with a flinch that honored honesty if nothing else. "The worm girl told me to aim at the white-haired witch." Missandei stood very still. Grey Worm did not move at all. Daenerys's face went from winter to a different season that the city had not seen yet. Eddard took the blow of that word and then laid it down. He did not pick it up. "Worm girl?" he asked, and the boy looked at Grey Worm's spear and realized language has assorted prices. "The woman," the boy said quickly, and then weakly, "Not the soldier. Describe her," Eddard said. The boy did. The description was too generic to be anything but half-lie. Eddard let breath go and called for bread. "We will feed him," he said to Daenerys. when she looked as if her eyes had bellies of their own. "We will feed him, and then we will hang him. I could spare him," she said. "I could make a gesture. And the men who sent him will continue to send boys," he answered. "And those boys will be fed on your mercies until they starve the city. This city requires—" He stopped because he had been about to say stiffness, and he worked instead to say, "a straight line, not an iron one. This is the worst kind of case. It requires decency applied with relentless boredom." It was not poetry. It was a sentence he would use later on himself. They hanged him at dawn because dawn is when the city hears such things best. They did it cleanly. The body dropped and the neck broke and there was no thrashing. Eddard said a small prayer to gods Daenerys ignored and Missandei tolerated. Not for the boy's soul, which is a matter for gods, but for the men who would later tell their sons the story of how the queen hanged a child who was trying to free them. He went home after and sat with his head in his hands like any man who has done a necessary thing and hates it. And then he got up and wrote an ordinance that made it easier for boys to get work that would tire them too much to consider heroics. He did not allow himself relief when 3 days passed without masks. He did not let his guard admire itself when a week did. And when, on a certain market day, a woman in a yellow dress spilled her basket of onions at Missandei's feet and apologized without apology, while her companion watched the corners of the street instead of her hands, Eddard saw the shape of a world where men kept trying and learned to count their unspectacular victories loudly, so that their children could at least hear them over the noise of the failures. He met with a woman from Noth who spoke softly not because she was shy but because she was tired of shouting to be heard. Her name was Larima. She had invented a way to boil water in lidded jars and carry it far without it sickening by noon. Her partner was a baker with scars under his sleeves, and the laugh of a man who has taught himself to be generous because no one else had. They had built a cooperative of sorts for clean water, a word Larima did not use and which Eddard did not introduce because importing vocabulary invites contempt. He took them to the queen. He watched Daenerys catch it, the spark she had when she saw not just a man or a woman but a diagram. They gave Larima a stipend that was not an insult, and a public station where she could teach. They codified the access. They made water less proud of its sickness. Men love to say that kings and queens move armies and that is how the world changes. Sometimes the world changes because a woman carries a jar carefully and shows another woman how to carry it without spilling, and because the law notices and writes it down word for word. Eddard had learned to prefer these victories. They did not make widows. Ravens came late, as ravens do when the wind tells them new names. The first letter was from a ship captain whose common was drunk with salt. He had seen at White Harbor arms flying that were stitched and not painted, and a man in armor that had not seen neglect. The second letter was from an old friend who did not know he was alive, who told him in the dry language of trade that the North was harder than an axe and twice as patient. The letter was careful as men are careful when every word can be purchased by a man who knows whom to bribe. Eddard carried it near his ribs for a day. He did not show it. He folded it into the pile of papers on his desk and buried it under less significant papers because secrets often survive best when they live beside trivia. He had done it all his life. He had become good at hiding the important in the ordinary. It had not saved him once. It might save this city. He found Ser Barristan in the armory one morning, oiling a sword as if it were a pet. The old knight was humming, of all things, a tune Eddard recognized from a day when the air had smelled of straw and delicate cruelty. "You carry songs with you," Eddard said. "They carry me," Ser Barristan answered. "When a man has worn this much steel, he must find some way for the weight to sound like more than a burden." He looked up. "You have found ways to turn our queen's energies into rules. I would say I envy you if envy could work its way through this old leather I wear for skin. You have your own art," Eddard said. "I do not want to learn it again." "No," Ser Barristan said. "You learned it once. It did not suit you. You were not made to enjoy the part where a man's skill at death makes him feel special." "I prefer putting death far from the scene entirely," Eddard said. "I am not always allowed my preference." "None of us are," Ser Barristan said. "But it is a fine preference to bring. She needs it." He paused. "You took a dart for her." "I would have taken two if the day insisted," Eddard said. "You have already—" Ser Barristan murmured. It was as close as the old man would come to naming the other sacrifice Eddard lived under. They let silence join them. It was good silence. Orze came to him with a proposition dressed as a complaint. Your judges, she said, late in the afternoon when fatigue gives small irritations long noses, have become queens in their quarter. Men must sit and listen. Women, gods bless them, have started to use the law as if it were theirs. This will annoy the old men farther than the pits ever did. Make a small concession elsewhere to appease them. What concession? He asked, suspicious even as he admitted she was right. Meereen could only swallow so much new at once. Allow a festival of the old gods, Orze said. With conditions. Make it partially stupid. We will all despise it. But it will tell the city you respect its calendar as you make your own. The thing about people, Lord Stark, is they require their pasts to be acknowledged even when they know their pasts have been foolish. You want me to bless a holiday that set men in chains, he said flatly. I want you to let families march, Orze said, and sing that song about the long brick and the lion and the winds that you find so offensive. I want you to let them be ridiculous. Free people are ridiculous. It will terrify them. That terror will make them choose you more easily. This is cynical and kind. Learn to love what can be both. He took it to the queen. She did not like it. She had a look she gave ideas she recognized as useful and hated for the implications they forced her to admit. You want me to sta. ND on a balcony while they invoke gods who love chains, she said. You will stand, and you will not spit, he said. And if a gold mask uses the crowd to draw a line of blood to my feet, then the law we have written together will become visible loudly, he returned. I will not pretend it is without danger. I am saying only that this is one of the ways courage looks, allowing joy that is not yours to require your patience. She swallowed it like a hard fruit and did not show the bite. We will do it, she said, and you will walk with me. I will, he said. The festival was thinner than the old men remembered and richer than it had been when they were young, which is how memory punishes the stubborn. The songs annoyed Eddard less than he had expected. There was a loveliness in watching children laugh at costumes their grandfathers had once feared. There was a relief in hearing drums that did not call for blood. A woman who had an admirable disdain for pomp offered Daenerys a cup of spiced milk and did not curtsy. The queen drank and handed it back with a word of thanks that transformed two men on the spot into something less stupid. Eddard walked a step behind and to the side and tried to learn the choreography of acceptance. On the return through the market, a boy in a mask shaped like a crocodile touched his hand and said, "Are you the wolf?" He nodded without sentiment. That night the city did not become gentler because cities do not, but it became easier to sleep in. The ships from Yunkai returned to their harbor carrying men who still thought themselves offended by time. Their envoys came dressed in yellow bleached by sun, and they proclaimed tariffs as if they were laws that kindness had corrupted. Daenerys sat and heard them with the politeness of a blade flensed of all ornament. Eddard watched them pretend not to notice him. He watched them overreach. He recommended patience in his voice and steel in his terms. They left insulted and a little encouraged, which is the right shape for enemies who still own too many warehouses. Skahaz descended into the city's guts and came up with names of men who would burn those warehouses for a handful of copper and a story to brag about later. Eddard forbid it with the weary weight of a father telling boys that fire makes children of us all. He sent Grey Worm to move certain goods silently from the reach of bribed guards to places where honest guards would be embarrassed to fail. He placed Missandei behind a screen with a merchant of cloth, so that she could hear the way that man changed his price after 2 cups of wine and adjust the tax so that his profit fornicated with modesty rather than pride. It was all petty. It was the work of governance. He loved it for being petty because it made the men who wanted glory uncomfortable, and he had buried too many glorious men. He told Daenerys one evening because she had asked what Winterfell had smelled like when the winter stores were checked at first frost. He did not tell her well. He told her truth. He told her about the fat of candles, the way tallow coats a throat if a room is not aired properly, the sour of dried apples, the clean hush of smoked meats hung high, the fearful pride of the steward who wants to show his lord that the numbers have been read and obeyed and who does not want to be seen wanting that praise. She listened and did not pretend to a memory she could not own. "We will have our own smells," she said, half vow, half comfort. "We do," he said. "Limes and dust and ink and dragons." "And blood," she said. "And blood," he agreed. "We are trying to write less of it into the stone." There were nights he could not breathe, not because of heat but because of his past. He took those nights to the terrace and counted the lamps in the view as if tallying grain. He let memory have a chair and did not invite it to bed. He said his sister's name a few times under his breath, the way men taste bitter herbs to keep their appetites honest. He asked the old gods for small things. He stopped asking for large ones because that had always felt like an insult to any deity that had watched men for long. He asked, on one such night, for health for a boy he would not name and safety for two women who had been children across too many hallways all at once. He gave thanks for Missandei's patience and for Grey Worm's moral geometry, and that is all prayer a man is really allowed. When the answer came from across the sea, it had a peculiar accent. The first letter to survive the crossing and the spies who fed on them came from a man who was nobody and believed himself a somebody because he signed for a house with a history older than his height. He informed the queen that she could come if she wished, but that she would be better served to send him money to prove she had it. Eddard read it and smiled in a way that made Missandei raise an eyebrow. "A man who thinks he is borrowing against my future," Daenerys said dryly. "He will make himself useful if we decide to humiliate him." "There is more," Eddard said, and produced a smaller paper tucked inside the larger that had slipped hidden in the gutter of the seal. His hand was unpracticed but purposeful. It said only, "We hear a wolf breathes and a girl lives." It had no name. It did not ask. Eddard sat very carefully. He felt his heart insult him for being still. Daenerys's hand touched the paper not to take it from him but to share its weight. "We continue," she said, after his silence had asked more questions than noise could. He nodded. They did. He set in place then the plan that would be a plan for months. A slow bleeding of the city's need for him into a competence that could live without his pulse near the desk. He met with the judges again and again until their tempers and his had become familiar enough to be wicked to one another without damage. He asked Grey Worm to choose a second and a third to receive matters he could not receive. Grey Worm did, not grudgingly but with the care of a man who knows how to build a good spear. He named a quiet soldier with a scar on the cheek that had not been earned in battle and a woman whose hands looked too elegant to hold iron until one saw the grip she put on a shaft. He asked Missandei to train two scribes who would share the work of being the city's ear. She did and made them read aloud their work to one another until their shame burned off like fog. He let Orze teach a young noble with decent bones how to lose an argument and still like himself. He set aside a room with a window and made certain it had more chairs than a private office would need. He did this because he had learned to hate the kind of power that occurs when a person craves being alone and calls it service. The queen trained, too. She practiced leaving men unsatisfied without rupturing them. She taught herself to accept information that hurt her pride and to test it without looking as if she doubted every face that brought her anything. She allowed herself 3 rages a week and spent them as a miser spends a gold coin. She was a kind woman, which worried Eddard more than cruelty would have. Kindness is a lever that moves too much if applied wrong. He showed her how to brace it. She showed him when to let it go. They carried one another's corrections the way friends carry the ends of a table downstairs. Grunting, laughing more than once, not making a speech about it. They gathered ships like a patient flew. Eddard sat in a counting house that belonged to a man who had carved elephants on his chairs to remind everyone he had visited places where men pretend elephants are gods, and he described tonnage with the seriousness of a priest. He knew nothing technical. He learned enough to make men believe he could not be defrauded quickly. He was defrauded slowly instead. He forgave the lesser amount and produced, in exchange, a law about sailors' wages that made his merchant honorable because being fed on his own vanity made him efficient. He did not enjoy this part. He did it well because he had decided to. He told Daenerys that the fleet they were building would not be pretty. She said she cared only that it floated and did not mutiny. He said he could guarantee the first and promised to work on the second. There was a small war in a district that had learned to love the queen by reading and not by hunger. The old families funded boys with bad tempers and made them feel useful by calling them militia. The freedmen who had endured too many insults treated them like pests and made mockery a plan. Eddard went to the corner where the two roads met and did not bring soldiers. He brought 5 bakers with baskets and set them up under a lime tree. He brought a water cellar. He brought Missandei with a board and chalk. He announced, without trumpets, that anyone who struck a man would not be served. He sat on a bench and said nothing. It took an hour and a punch and a withheld cup and then 3 laughs that did not belong to anyone before the boys realized their courage demanded a better stage. He asked Orze to find the money for a tournament for boys to run in the morning. She did and made it thinner on purpose so that brawling remained hotter but cheaper. They contained it. No one wrote a song. The wound closed. He visited the Dothraki who had stayed because they had learned that the city was manure and enticing. He spoke to a KO who had once threatened to cut him in half for the sheer orderliness of it. The man now scratched a belly that had learned kitchen. He met a child whose mother had died in the first weeks and who had been raised by 3 men who pretended not to love him because they feared what it would make of them. He watched them lose face and gain a son in the space of an afternoon when the boy fell from a low wall and bellowed and was scooped up. He told the queen to watch how those men treated power, grabbing it when it was falling, setting it on its feet, hitting it once in the back of the head when it ran too far. She understood. She sent them bread and useful work and did not insult them with gratitude. He took the queen once to a small stand of scraggly trees that had learned to grow out of brick. The leaves made a patient noise. He said, "In the north, we say words in front of trees. It is a waste of time if you do not care for the listening they do. It is a luxury if you do. I am told people here speak their wishes into jars of honey and then eat the honey when the wish is granted. That is either superstition or a lesson about sweetness. We can let both be true." She stood a while. She said nothing aloud. She touched a trunk. "You would put a tree on my coin before my face," she said later. "I would put a balance and a dragon," he said, "and hide a tree in the filigree." "You are sentimental," she said. "No," he answered. "I am greedy. I want your reign to outlast your bones. That requires that men love what they think you love and that what they think you love be something that comforts them when they do not like you. Trees will do." She laughed, which did not mean agreement. He did not require it. There was a day when the heat broke and the city smelled of mud. It made everyone a little kinder. Even the harpies on their rooftops looked less ridiculous. Eddard walked a line of merchants and listened to what they did not say. He noticed a man whose hands were too clean for the debt he claimed. He noticed a girl whose eyes were not flinching enough for the slap she described. He set Missandei to check the first man's books and told Grey Worm to send women to the girl's house in pairs for 3 evenings without identifying themselves. In both cases, the city rewarded their suspicion with truth. They did nothing dramatic with this. They adjusted a tax. They invited a midwife to come live nearer the square. Small acts have a way of coming back as boats on a tide. He woke one night tea. Oh, find he had written his dead wife's name on a scrap of parchment and then written it again. He did not make it a spectacle. He burned it and watched the smoke make a small map on the air. He said aloud, to the emptiness that a man can afford when he has done his day, that he had tried to do right by their children and had failed and succeeded in measures that no one could measure. He did not apologize to ghosts. Ghosts require nothing from us. He spoke the names of the living in a room where his breath fogged the glass and then did not. Daenerys came to him with a list of men and women whose lives had bent on account of her and asked whether she should pay them. He said yes for some, no for others. He taught her the grammar he had learned at a cost. That sometimes the best form of repayment is to let people use the room your power created without charging them rent. And that sometimes the worst punishment is to insist a man accept you as his savior when he wants to save himself. She took that and made it sharper. She paid the wrong person once. He told her. She was angrier than when enemies had tried to kill her. He saw in that anger a promise that would keep the city. The day came when the harbor showed more sails that answered to the queen than to the city below. and the wind shifted so that the palace stopped smelling like fish for a week. It made men too happy. Eddard curtailed the celebrations and was loathed for an afternoon. He accepted it. He had taught himself to be disliked by people he meant to serve without resenting them. He told Daenerys that they could go, not at once, but that the city would not collapse if she left a circle of watchers and a law to bite where hands grew greedy. She said, "Finally," in a tone that meant not joy but the end of excuses. "Not full finally," he said. "There remain 100 small traps that we will see and 100 more we will admire only when we are away. You make leaving sound like a garden we must weed for others to enjoy," she said. "It is," he said. "If you have not learned to enjoy that, I have failed." "I enjoy nothing I cannot set on fire," she said dryly, and he loved her then for the lie she told to make courage easier. He wrote last instructions in a hand that would be mocked by priests of beauty if they featured such things in their sermons. He made 3 stacks. One stack was titled by Missandei when he could not bring himself to title it, "If we die." One was "If we go and return." One was "If we do not return." He kept the last in a place where heat could not reach and instructed Grey Worm in the exact hour when to open it and the exact hour not to. He told the judges they would be hated. He made them laugh to see which ones understood how that challenges the spine and suits the belly. He left bread in the little hall where children were taught letters. He had a tree moved from the palace garden down into the square. Men thought him mad. He argued long enough with the gardener to earn his hatred and his admiration both, then had the hole dug himself because there are lessons only shovels teach. He sat with Daenerys one last evening while the city rehearsed sleeping. They drank watered wine because wine makes men talk, and they had already said more than decision permits. She asked him, "What will you say to them, your people? When we arrive with my dragons and your rules and their hunger?" "I will say what I have said to you," he answered. "That kindness is not weakness and the law is a love letter written in acid. That mercy without account is cowardice and justice without mercy is vanity. I will tell them we have come to ask them to behave better than they thought they could. I will tell them we will fail them often. I will promise we will do it honestly. And if they say no?" she asked without melodrama. "We will show them hunger that is theirs and feed it in public and make generosity fashionable," he said. "We will make it costly to be cruel. We will use every dull tool. We will be bored, and in our boredom they will be saved from men who come to be excited." He added, because it was what he could give her, "We will show them you are not your father. Some men must learn slowly. Some will never learn. We will outlast more of them than is decent to boast about." She set her cup down. "I will need you there to say it," she said finally, and it was not a command. It was an admission of the worst sort, reliance. "You will have me," he said, "as long as the city can do without me." "And if it cannot?" she asked, not provoking him. "Then I have failed and I will return," he said. "Or I will die on the way and you will find someone who is less sentimental and more fashionable, and you will be fine because you have learned the most difficult sentence a ruler can utter. I do not know." He smiled without mirth. "You have learned to enjoy not knowing. It makes you dangerous in the right way." She stood. She walked to the edge of the terrace and looked east and then west as if she could see both water and desert asleep under the same quilt. "We go soon," she said, in a manner that makes going seem less like a vow and more like an appointment we are early for, he said. She laughed. He let himself, just then, think of the boy he had named and kept and misnamed and lost and found in rumor again. He thought of a throne that might not kill the men who played at it if the right woman sat and made sitting a practice rather than a spectacle. He thought of winter. He thought of limes. He thought of pomegranates piled in a mess at his door by hands he never saw. He thought of wood smoke in halls where the laughter is not loud but honest. He thought of dragons drawing letters in the air that forced men finally to read. The morning they set a date, Missandei brought him a tray and sat without speaking until he had eaten half. He asked her if she had ever seen snow. She said only in her mind. He told her it hurts and then ets, that it makes honest the mistakes of the ground, that it reminds men to walk slowly. She translated that into 4 languages in under a minute, as if to prove to both of them that the world was large enough for any weather to be made comprehensible. He signed the last ordinance of that season with a splintered quill. He opened a chest and took out a cloak that had been kept respectfully useless. He did not put it on. He left it for the man he had trained to sit in his chair without feeling the need to make the wood prove itself. Grey Worm came to his doorway when the sun was only a thought. He did not say, as other men would have, "Be careful." He said firmly, "Return with hands. The queen will need them." "I will bring my hands back," Eddard said gravely. "I have grown attached to them." "You may lose a finger," Grey Worm allowed. "We will accept." "Not two." Missandei's mouth moved into something that in any other person would have been called a smile, and in her had too many meanings to waste on one word. "You are a strange man," she said. "I am glad the strangest parts have been useful." "I am too," he said. "It is a relief to stop pretending the strange should be hid." The dragons flew that day as if indulging them. The city watched as if it had been promised more than spectacle. Men quarreled and then stopped because leaving demands a certain amount of concentration. Orze sent him a sack of pomegranates that she signed for with a sarcastic flourish he admired. The judges sent him a list of questions longer than the letter of the law required, and he read it with gratitude and did not answer because they had learned to answer them better than he could. Ser Barristan sked at his posture and then hugged him, which made them both feel foolish and more honest than knighthood usually allows. Dario winked and said nothing offensive, which Eddard assumed was a form of respect. Skahaz promised to practice boredom, which was the finest compliment. He went to the terrace one last time as a man of this city. He put his hand on the stone that had held heat and rain and ash and breath. He said to it, as he had not said to any person, "I have tried." The stone did not answer. It had seen too much to be impressed by men. He found that comforting. When the hour came, he walked beside his queen and did not count the steps. Men will say later that they took the city with them when they went. Eddard knew better. The city stayed. It was supposed to. The city watched them leave and went back to the work of making laws into bread. He walked to the ship that would make him seasick and smiled in advance at the indignity. He boarded. He stood at the prow as he had months ago and felt the difference in his bones. He had died and died again. He had learned a new patience. He had acquired a new fear. He had earned a new hope. He stood with his gray hair touched by a different sun and watched Meereen become smaller but no less real. Daenerys stood at his side in a cloak that would be useless in a north that had forgotten this heat existed. She did not look back as much as men expected her to. She looked forward, where water made a road. She said, into air that had practiced their voices, "You will tell me the names as we go, the names I should know, the houses I should insult by accident and then forgive and then break, the roads that go nowhere and the wells that do not run dry. Tell me everything I will forget." "I will," he said, "and you will forget most, and I will tell you again. And one day you will not need me, and I will be relieved and jealous." She glanced at him quick as a gull. "And then we will eat something that is not spiced for once," he said, "and argue about whether you should ride into Winterfell or walk, and decide neither is right and do both in the wrong order." She laughed and the sound ran ahead of the ship like a scout. The sails took wind. Meereen became a shape on the edge of story. The sea opened with an ordinary majesty that humbled both dragons and men. Eddard unlaced the habit of anxiety and laced it again tighter, because the West was not going to forgive being asked to change. He thought of a boy at a gate in snow. He thought of women whose faces would read this queen and find in them their own hunger and their own relief. He thought of the law as a rope that can hold a family's weight if tied correctly. He thought of the boats behind and the boats ahead. He thought of the sky. They slid out of the bay. The little dragon that had grown beyond Little Arced and cast a shadow over water that made sailors mutter prayers and then grin because they were sailors, and any omen is good when you are going home. Eddard told himself it was home. He allowed himself that theft because he meant to pay for it with work. He had coin enough in that. He put his hand on the rail. He closed his eyes and spoke the names of trees in his mind. He opened them and looked at the woman he had chosen to tell the truth to, even when it would ruin them. "Your Grace," he said, and she turned and he began.